Hello, Dr. Koons. How are you?
Hello, Eddie. Very well, thanks. Thanks so much for having me on. Look forward to it.
Tell us a little bit about yourself for those who may not be familiar, and shame on you if you're not familiar.
Yeah, thanks. I teach philosophy at the University of Texas in Austin. I've been there 35 years now. Did my Ph.D. at UCLA. And let's see, I work mostly in metaphysics and, as you said, philosophy of religion and sort of related areas. Trained as an analytic philosopher, but very interested now in Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas.
Right, rock on. So you picked all the good parts of the country to go to school. UCLA and then Austin, and
went to Michigan State. That was also a lovely place.
Oh yeah,
well, very cold though.
If you like snow, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Definitely. So, have you always been a Christian? Did you grow up in a Christian home?
Yeah, I grew up in a very devout Christian home. That's right. Mother and father, serious Christians. When I was in high school, I got actually involved with Campus Crusade, and that helped expose me to things like C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer actually came up, and that I think that was one of the first philosophical thoughts I had already in high school. Went to college, didn't really know what philosophy was. My advisor told me to take a course in philosophy, so I did, and it started with the ancient Greeks, and I just immediately got hooked. So it's been philosophy ever since, basically.
Yeah, that's it's philosophy is one of those things. It just either you're turned off or it just grabs you and hooks you, and there's no escaping.
Yeah, my son is studying philosophy right now at Yale, and my two daughters, zero interest in philosophy.
Wow.
So, it's an interesting division.
Well, great job.
Yeah.
Yale. At least you got one of them too.
Yeah, that's right. My girls are great too.
Yeah, my girls are just like, no, I don't want anything to do with it. I'm so used to, having, discussions and things and being, a big fan of critical thinking.
My daughter, when she was young, when she didn't want to go to sleep, she knew how to do this. When I started to go to bed, she said, "Daddy, do we know that God exists?" Well, okay. So she didn't really. I don't think she really wanted the answer. She just wanted to be able to stay up a few minutes longer, and she knew I couldn't resist.
Yeah. So let me tell you the story about Thomas Aquinas, and
right, exactly.
Mine they get so tired of that doesn't follow.
Sometimes
it's hard to take
in people's thinking. It's not a big.
You don't win people over.
Settings. That's right.
You don't win people over. Just calling out fallacies. It's funny you mentioned that because I'm known as the fallacy guy amongst my friends. Kind of a running joke because. I'll joking around. I'll be like, "Oh, yeah, that's a genetic fallacy." So something like that. So, what got you interested in Aquinas, particular in Thomism?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it was I probably pretty well into my career. I think about maybe 20 years ago. So I'd already been, or 25, somewhere in there. Been a philosopher for 10 or 15 years. And actually, I was just teaching a lot of logic at the time. And I wanted to do formal logic mostly, but I wanted to be able to apply formal logic to real world problems and natural language arguments and that sort of thing. So I just looking for arguments. So I thought, well, there's Aquinas, right? For 5 ways. Let's dig those out. I know they're not very good arguments, right? That's what I was taught, and dusted them off and looked at them. And at the time, actually, I've been working on causation independently as a part of my metaphysics. And looked at the second and third way, especially. I thought, actually, these are kind of interesting arguments, right? Not fallacious again, as I thought, as I've been taught they were. You can give fallacious interpretation. You can interpret them as fallacies if you want, but that's not the way you're supposed to approach philosophy. Especially when you're dealing with a great mind, you have to try and figure out what's the argument really, and they turn out to be quite good arguments, I think. So that kind of turned me on to Aquinas. And then you start reading more of him, and it's just again, he's addictive.
Yes, you want to kind of master his level of thinking. You want to get inside his head and really think like he did, and it's so difficult.
There's almost no question you can think of in theology that he hasn't addressed somewhere.
that is true. He wrote a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, they say he had 3 secretaries working at once, and he would just dictate 3 different books at once to these 3 scribes. Man, an amazing mind.
Yeah, I felt the same way about the 5 ways. It was, that's been debunked so many times. This is a fallacy. And like you said, you got to steel man the position. You got to try and, understand it from their perspective.
Yeah. My colleague Dan Bonavac here at UT and I are actually just starting to work on a book on the 5 ways, and that'll be the theme really, which is let's find the best argument here. Let's not dismiss it too quickly. And in particular, I think a lot of people, I'll go back to Anthony Kenny, think that the arguments depend upon outdated Aristotelian cosmology and physics. The crystalline spheres and and all of that. And I think that's just wrong. I think that they all depend on principles that are much more enduring than any of the secondary or tertiary parts of Aristotle's cosmology.
Yeah, I've noticed amongst a lot of people who dismiss the 5 ways that it doesn't seem that they really understand exactly, like, for example, the argument from design or the teleological argument. It's not, they'll think it's like intelligent design or something like that. And it's like, no, it is so much deeper than that. It is, the metaphysics there is just so robust.
We're finding that's the hardest one actually for us, the 5th way. We're still working on it. Because on the one hand, it seems like that's the most intuitive in a sense, but when you start digging into it, it's pretty difficult to work it out.
Yeah, I agree. It's if people would think about it, at least in the proper way, basically, everything has a pointedness. It has a it's not like we're looking at DNA strands and saying, "Oh, look, it's designed." It's more about the fundamentals of things that exist.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because this is an area that analytic philosophy is sort of catching up with Aquinas and Aristotle in recent years. There's been a big boom in what's called powers ontology, thinking about causal powers, both active and passive powers. And all of that is quickly leads you to teleology, final causation purposes. Because if an electron has the power to repel other electrons, it will have that power even if there aren't any other electrons around, right? That power itself has reference to a merely possible future, right? And it says this electron is sort of ordered to a future where if it does encounter other negatively charged things, it will repel them. And so that's already purpose in the Aristotelian sense of the word. So that's become rehabilitated. A lot of people now are taking this sort of thing much more seriously than they used to. So at least that gets you the first step of the 5th way. There is indeed purpose in nature. I think that's I'll find much more agreement about that nowadays among my analytic colleagues than I would have 20 years ago, let's say. And then to get from there to God, of course, it's not easy.
Absolutely. Well, that's why Aquinas had 5 steps. It was.
Well, the other thing that people misunderstand about the 5 ways is that at the end of each 5 ways, he says, "And this we all call God," and people read that and think, "Oh, okay, so natural theology is done, right? Once you've got through the 5 ways, you've already gotten to the God who's omnipotent, omniscient, and all the rest." And that's not the case at all. The 5 ways is just the first 5 steps, or the first one complex step on what in Thomas's natural theology goes on for another 40 some articles in the Summa Theologia. He hasn't even established there's one God yet, much less that he's all powerful and all good, and all that comes much later. And it's very, very carefully worked out step by step. So read someone like Dawkins' God Delusion. He spends a page and a half, I think, on 5 ways, and mostly he just says, "Well, this isn't God, right? First mover." Well, yeah. And when Aquinas says we call that God, he just means it's just a foreshadowing of future attractions, right? Look for me to then eventually show you that this is indeed God. He's not actually claiming that he's proven that God has all the typical characteristics of that stage. But it's of course crucial first step, because if you don't have an uncaused first cause of being and necessity and so on, then you're never going to be able to get to God via the kind of approach that Thomas takes.
Yeah, I think Western thought modern day Western thought gets in the way of trying to understand the scholastics.
Yeah.
There
was a huge revolt against Aristotle, right, in the 16th, 17th century. And so the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, to use the cliche, right? There were undoubtedly, the problem, of course, was that Aristotle had been so impressive that there was a kind of excessive deference that's paid to him at a certain point. Every little thing he says has got to be right. And of course, that turned out to be wrong, right? And so then Descartes and the others say, okay, so let's just throw the whole thing out, right? Start all over again. And that was a huge mistake, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think with, Aristotle, his metaphysics is crucial to understanding, Thomas Aquinas.
No question.
Yeah.
And the other thing to bear in mind here is, you can't really even go directly from Aristotle to Aquinas, because what Aquinas is doing here is drawing on a 2,000-year research project, basically, that Aristotle starts, but that other people contribute to, Plotinus, Avicenna, and others, and Aquinas knows all of that. And so he's, at the time, he's one of the most well-read, most educated people of history, right? And he's able to pull together all of that and synthesize it. Aristotle is you crucially have to understand Aristotle, but you should also know a little bit about the tradition that leads from Aristotle onward.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's it seems like I've heard stated before, Aquinas seemed to be kind of trying to take empiricism and rationalism and find a common middle ground that they could work together with the natural theology. And
that's right.
Yeah.
Given Aristotle's approach, it's pretty clear that neither rationalism nor empiricism can make sense, right? You have to take into account all the different powers of the human mind, both sensitive and rational. And that's what Aristotle and Thomas do so well. And then people, again, as you say, someone like Hume or Berkeley just tries to go one way to the complete exclusion of the other, and that just leads to disaster.
Right. So for those people who may be watching and they're scratching their head talking about the 5 ways, let's briefly go through them. With part 1, the argument for motion. What do you think is probably the biggest mistake people make when they evaluate this?
So it is. Well, I guess there's a couple things. One is that the word motion, both in the Greek and Latin here, mean change of any kind, actually. So it's not just locomotion, movement in space, but things becoming warmer or bigger or whatever. Those all would count as motion. So we're really interested in the nature of change. And I think another mistake that people make here is this is where it's very tempting to think that this depends on some kind of peculiar physics that Aristotle's relying on that we no longer believe in. In particular, people think that Aristotle was working in a world where there was no inertia. So once something gets moving, you needed something to keep it moving. It wouldn't just sort of move on its own, because they think that he just had a physics where there was no inertia, where everything that moves has got to be kind of pushed along by something else. That's not actually true, because Aristotle's sorry, this will be a slight diversion into his actual astronomy, but his astronomical theory was that the heavens are these concentric crystalline spheres that are rotating eternally. And so the sun is embedded in this crystalline sphere that's constantly rotating. There's nothing that's moving it, so to speak, except itself. It's being moved by a kind of intelligence or something, but it's inertial, right? It's not like there's gears there that are kind of moving the sun around. It is just moving around by its nature. So that's not the issue, right? The issue is not, is there inertia in the world? So then the question is, what is the issue, right? So why does he think? Okay, so one more thing that people get wrong. This is really important. Is that people assume, and this is Richard Dawkins' good example. People assume this is an argument for a beginning of the universe, right? A temporal beginning of the universe, right? That there had to be something that in the very beginning got things moving, and so that's God, and that's clearly not right. because Thomas thinks that philosophy cannot prove that the universe had a beginning in time. He thinks that philosophy has to be agnostic in the question of the beginning at time. So he thinks that the first way works, even in a world where there's no beginning in time, where the universe has eternally been moving this way, and these spheres have been moving themselves in some sense forever without anything pushing them. And yet he still thinks you need to have a cause for the moving that's going on. So I've got a particular take on the first way. It's somewhat unique, I think. I don't know if anyone else has taken exactly this tack. So just fair warning, right? This is Koons' interpretation first way. It's not the standard interpretation. But I think you have to go back a bit here, and you have to understand Aristotle's conception of time itself. What is time? And he's got a very interesting theory, which I think is a very attractive theory once you understand it. And that is that time is the measure of change. So in order for time to happen, change has to happen. Change comes first, and time is the measure of that. That's, you might think, well, duh, right? But actually, the modern conception of time is quite different. The modern conception of time is that time is a kind of fourth dimension. It's a sort of event spread out in this fourth dimension. And change is just being in different states at different points in time, right? So to move from Austin to Dallas is just to be in Austin at one point in time, Dallas at a later point in time, and various other points in between. That's what motion is. So the modern conception takes time for granted and then tries to define motion or change in terms of time. Aristotle says, no, you have to start with change and then define time in terms of change, not the other way around. Okay. So you might say, well, why go with Aristotle? Well, there's a lot of reasons, actually, to go with Aristotle here. One is the standard conception has no explanation as to why time is like it is. Why is it spread out in the way that it is along this dimension? Why does it continue to go in both directions? And in particular, there's a very big problem for the modern view. What explains the era of time? How can we explain that past is different from future? Right? Aristotle can explain that because all change for Aristotle, this goes back to our earlier discussion, all change is directed, is change from something, towards an end. And so change already has a direction built into it. So time gets a direction parasitically from the direction of change itself. And I think that's right. That's absolutely on the right path. So anyway, if you accept that story, or at least as a hypothesis, let's say, that change is more important than time, then the fact that then inertia turns out to be completely irrelevant to the first way, because inertia says that if time passes and this thing is in motion at the beginning of time, then it will continue to be in motion as time passes. So inertia really is parasitic on the passage of time. Inertia just says as time passes, your velocity will stay constant. Interesting fact, true fact, but metaphysically not very interesting, right? Because what I really want to know is, why does time pass in the first place? Why does time move forward? And the answer has to be because change happens. Change comes first. Change sort of propels time forward. Okay, so some change is happening, but then what explains why that change is happening at that moment in time, right? Well, it either is something that's changeless, something that's non-temporal in nature, or it's something that's in time causing the change. If it's something in time causing the change, then the thing that's in time causing the change must itself change as it causes the change, right? Because it will have to change from not being a changer to being a changer, of not being a cause of that particular change to being a cause of that particular change, right? So in other words, the sun's got to move past some meridian, let's say, right? What causes it to move past that? Well, something in time does so. Maybe it's the gravitational field or whatever. Well, then the gravitational field will have to change from being not being the cause of the sun's passing that meridian to being the cause of that particular change. Right? So that's another change in time. So we need another cause that explains why the gravitational field changed in that way. And if that's in time, then you'll need another cause and so on. And so what Thomas is arguing, I think, is that the ultimate cause of change at any moment in time has to be something outside of time. It has to be something essentially changeless. Right? And that's all you get from the first way, right? There is an entity which is active, can cause change, but is not itself in time. It's not itself changing as it causes time. But that turns out to be a really, really interesting fact, if that's true. And you get all kinds of metaphysical mileage out of that simple fact, if it is indeed true.
Yeah, I've got just so many things popping up with, the change in relation to changing things. Is that a change?
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, the question too is, can we even make sense of the idea of an unchanging thing causing change, given what I just said, that it looks like it's going to have to change from not being the cause to being the cause of the change, or make some other change in order to keep going. And so the answer, I think, is that you have to think of the relationship between God, the first mover in this case, and time, on something like the analogy of an author and a book. Right? So I like to use Tolkien in Lord of the Rings. Right? So Tolkien is the cause of the 3 ages of the Lord of the Rings, if you know how this works, or 4 ages, depending on how you count them, right? And all the different temporal relations within the story, right? But if I ask, when did Tolkien write the Lord of the Rings? Was it in the first age or the second age, right? Was it before or after, Gandalf died? That question makes no sense. You can't locate Tolkien's writing in the time span of the Lord of the Rings. In the same way, you can't ask, when is God causing, me to lift this can? Because his causation of the universe is outside of the time of this universe, right? He causes it by just saying, let it be, the whole thing, past, present, and future. And that doesn't involve any change within him. But anything else inside time that's causing change has to change in order to cause change. And so it can't be a stopping point for the explanation of why time itself moves forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's kind of the way that I, broke it down, like to my daughters or something like that. God is like, he's the author. He's outside of the story. This story is here and it was created by him. So yeah, that's and have you seen Eleanor Stump's how she does the depiction of God and time in relation? She was on Closer to Truth, and
yeah, I know some of the work that she did years ago with Norman Kretzmann. So I think, I'm sure that she has a similar kind of view of God.
Yeah, it is. But the visual it's so kind of clarifying, the way that she does it. And I really had an aha moment. I was like, oh, okay, I see. So anybody,
I'll look that up. That sounds interesting.
Yeah. It's just a short video on Closer to Truth, and it's she's asked about God in relation to time, and she draws a little image and depiction, and I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. So okay, moving on to the argument from efficient cause, which would be predicated obviously on the 4 causes of Aristotle. And efficient cause would be the agent itself.
Yeah. I mean, I take the second way to be focusing really on the fact of existence. Right? Why do things exist? For Aristotle, you can actually talk about both the existence of what he calls substances, like you and me, the kind of fundamental building blocks of reality, and also the existence of our accidents, like our various characteristics, like the existence of my ability to speak English, or my being 6 foot tall, and so on. Those also kind of exist. But I think the second way really applies to both. It just recognizes that there's existence out there. Again, I think it's helpful to back up a little bit and to say, well, what's so special about existence? Well, for Aristotle, there's an important distinction here between what's potential and what's actual. And he's the first one to really clearly formulate that. So there are all kinds of things that are potential and that were potential that aren't actual, right? I could have trained to become a plumber instead of a philosopher. And so if I had, I would now be a plumber, but I'm not. That's merely a potentiality that sort of passed by at some point. I could, there are other potentialities for the future, right? I could potentially, I guess, go to Afghanistan, I suppose, next year, but I probably won't, right? So that's a future-oriented potentiality that's probably going to remain potential. So there are all these possibilities or potentialities that are out there, right? In a way, again, they're built into the fact that things have causal powers, right? That they don't have necessarily exercise. especially people. So there are all these possibilities out there. Among all those possibilities, there are some that are special, that are actual, right? So something's been added to them, right? Something's been added to my being a philosopher that wasn't added to my being a plumber, that makes it actual that I'm a philosopher. And so what the second way I think is saying is that, look, where you find these things combined, where they don't have to be combined, there's nothing about the logic of my being a philosopher that tells you that it has to be actual, or about the nature of actuality that it has to include me as a philosopher. They are just combined somehow. And so what we need to do is find a kind of source of this actual existence, something that explains how it got combined with one option and not the other, ultimately. Again, I could explain some of these things in terms of my own choices, so that I chose to be a philosopher and a plumber. That could be an explanation for the existence of that. But that still raises the question of, well, why did I exist in the first place with my power of free will? And so eventually you have to ask, why does anything exist, right? What's the explanation for existence in general? And it looks as though the only kind of the only options here are that there are some things that whose existence is uncaused, or there's infinite regresses of causation, where things are caused by other things, which are caused by other things, and so on, ad infinitum. And Thomas, and Aristotle both pretty quickly reject that second option and say that, look, that isn't really an explanation for where the existence came from. You're just kind of perpetually deferring the explanation. You're saying, well, it came from this. Well, where did that come from? Well, that came from that. That got from some other thing, and so on. But you're never really explaining where the existence came from in the first place. So we can talk more about that. But I think they're right to reject that infinite regress. So then that means that we have to have something that is a natural stopping point to this process, a thing whose existence doesn't need this kind of explanation. And remember, I said that the reason why I need to explain why I exist, or why I'm a philosopher, is that there's a kind of combination of two different things here: the possibility of my being a philosopher and actuality. They're somehow brought together to make me actually a philosopher. So what we need is something that's a being of pure actuality. That's the way Aristotle puts it: a being where the possibility of that being existing and the existing of that being are one and the same thing. Its very nature, its very essence is just existence, simpliciter, absolute existence. And that seems right to me. That is exactly the kind of stopping point you'd have to find in order to explain where everything else gets its existence. So that's the second way.
Yeah, and I often appeal to Aquinas as, God is not a being amongst beings. He is being itself, reality, existence. Yeah. And we participate in that reality. And when we really fully grasp that concept, it totally removes any issues with, miracles or interaction, and because we are woven into the fabric that is a reality along with it. So everything that depends on God,
right.
It can be moved, changed, or done any kind of way without any, interruption where right. I think Hume would say a violation of the laws of physics.
Right, right, exactly. Because nothing does anything except by God. So,
right.
There's no independent stuff that God has to interfere with in any way. Yeah. And the other thing that people, I think, misunderstand about this is already true in Aquinas' time, is if I say that God is being itself or existence itself, one might think, well, that's actually a very thin characterization, because like everything exists, the pen exists, the can exist, and so on. So you're saying that God is like this low common denominator that's shared by everything that exists. And the answer to that is that no, because those things merely participate in existence. There's existence which is combined with some finite limiting nature, which is why it's merely a pen or merely a can and merely a human being. Whereas in God's case, existence is not combined with anything, right? So it's absolute existence, right? And Thomas spends quite a bit of time later in the Summa arguing that such a being would have to be perfect, because if existence itself had built-in limitations, right, then that would be limitations of what was possible, right? Because nothing could exist without incorporating those limitations that are built into possibility itself, existence itself. So whatever is possible has got to already be there in existence, right? So that existence itself is unbounded, right? And so that's what God is like. He's unbounded. He's not the minimum kind of existence. He's the maximum kind of existence.
Would Aquinas's view be considered panentheism?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's no, I think, and for a couple of reasons. So he says that, of course, God is simple, so God can't be said to have any parts. So you and I couldn't really be said to exist in God, which is what panentheism entails. But also, it's not quite right to say that God is in us either, because Aquinas also says that God can't be combined with anything else. So he's also sort of mereologically isolated. He can't be a part of something larger than himself because he's so absolute. So it can't be literally true that he's in us, although we can say that he is in a sense because we participate in his being. So he is in us in his power, is the way Thomas would put it, but not in his essence. Yeah, that's close. That's as much I can say.
Yeah, that's well. It was something I often thought about. With panentheism and
I mean, the thing that's sort of right about panentheism, right, is that we don't want to think of as though God and the creation are just utterly separate from each other and independent, right? That would be kind of a deistic picture, and that's certainly not what we have here.
Yeah, So Aquinas would not object to the real concrete physical world existing independently, and I think that's one of the things that I go ahead.
Well, independence may be too strong a word, but it's distinct from God, right?
Objectively,
it isn't God. It isn't part of God.
Really independent.
Really
That's independence definitely not the right word for that.
Yeah.
On the infinite regress thing.
Yeah.
So I quite often I hear people, it's possible. And I, the same thing that you said, and, Josh Rasmussen says, and it's possible, but it doesn't tell us anything. There's no explanation.
Yeah.
So when we say that it's possible, that I know it's logically possible, it's metaphysically possible. Is it nomologically possible?
Yeah. So, I think Thomas actually thought it was. He thought that I think, at least he certainly thought it was metaphysically possible. He thought that God could have created a universe in which, in some sense, there's an infinite regress of causation. But Thomas, following Avicenna and others, make a distinction between per se and per accidents or accidental causal series. And the way I understand this is that a series which is sort of accidentally infinite is one where, yes, the effect has a cause and that has a cause and so on ad infinitum. But the fact that the series is infinite doesn't really matter. There's still an overarching explanation for the whole thing. And so the infinity is not ultimate, you might say, right? It's only sort of penultimate. The example that Aquinas gives would be of a blacksmith making a horseshoe and with a hammer. And he says, suppose a blacksmith used a hammer to make the horseshoe. Fine. Suppose he uses 2 hammers to make the horseshoe. Does that really change things? No, not really. 3 hammers? No. Suppose he used an infinite number of hammers to make this horseshoe, but he did it in the usual way. That's fine, right? And so likewise, God could have created me through an infinite number of intermediaries if he wanted to, but there'd still be this underlying cause, which was God, right, giving being to the whole infinite series, right? So I think that's an interesting way to go. And again, something that's important to recognize, because earlier I said, he rules out infinite regresses, and that's actually not quite right. So I'm glad I had a chance to correct myself and say he rules out what he calls a per se infinite regress. That is, an infinite regress that is itself not itself explained by anything else. Sort of ultimately infinite regress, you might call. That he thinks is impossible because, as you said, it wouldn't really be an explanation of anything. right? It certainly wouldn't explain where existence came from, my existence or yours.
Yeah, and that's another thing about Aquinas. I think a lot of people miss is he's willing to work within an eternal existence or being or universe. He wasn't a Kalam guy. So
now, I mean, full disclosure, I've written some positive things about Kalam arguments myself. So this is at one point where I cautiously disagree with Aquinas, maybe. But I think it's not a huge disagreement. Ultimately, it's just saying that that one of the things that he worried about, he didn't really have to worry about, because in fact, it may not be possible.
I definitely like variations of. I like the academic level cosmological arguments, not the YouTube philosophers.
Right.
So I guess it's time's kind of moving along. So we'll this one, part 3, is probably my favorite part of all of it, which we could probably do a whole show on.
Right.
But the argument to necessary being does he structure it like Leibniz does, or did Leibniz structure his after Aquinas's in a way?
Yeah, I mean, Leibniz is definitely drawing on not just Aquinas, but again, this whole tradition that stands behind Aquinas. There's a lot of the similar argument in Maimonides and Avicenna as well. And Leibniz is aware of, and Scotus actually. So Leibniz is kind of drawing people before and after Aquinas, as well as Aquinas himself. But there are some significant differences, I think. The focus really is, in the third way, in a way, the focus is still on existence, but now we're focusing specifically on contingent existence to begin with, existence that doesn't have any necessity, right? Either built into itself or deriving from something else, right? And the intuition is there's lots of things in the world that exist but could have failed to exist for a variety of reasons, right? I exist, but my parents, they might have never met each other, or the first date could have gone really badly, and so on, and so I might not exist. I could fail to exist, and it seems like there's lots of things like that. Maybe most things are like that. And then again, if you try to explain a contingent thing in terms of another contingent thing, in terms of another contingent thing, there's something unsatisfying about that, because a whole series of contingent things is still contingent. So now you just got a bigger thing that's contingent, that whose existence needs explanation. So the only really satisfying explanation stopper would be to get to a being that's necessary, that has being and couldn't fail to exist, has it of necessity. Right? And actually, that's just the first part of the third way, right? The second part of the third way then says, okay, even that's not God yet, because there could be things that, at least in principle, that have a kind of necessity, but not in and of themselves, but derive their necessity from something else. So if God, it's not clear that there are such things, but suppose that God, made the natural numbers exist, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And suppose that he's just the kind of person who would necessarily do that. So in fact, the number 1 and 2, they exist in every possible world. They couldn't really fail to exist because God's here and he's going to make them exist. But they don't have existence in themselves, right? Their existence depends on God, on something that has necessity of itself. And so again, Thomas argues, that if you had a bunch of things that had necessity, but not a necessity in themselves, but a kind of conditional necessity, there'd have to be something that has unconditional necessity in order to explain where these things got their conditional necessity. If you had just a series of conditionally necessary things, then again, there'd be no source for their necessity, right? The whole series would be, in a sense, not necessary, because you could just deny all the conditions, and there wouldn't be any undeniable condition that's supporting the whole thing. So I think it's an interesting argument. I think it's a valid argument, at least given the right kinds of assumptions. And that gives you a being that not only has necessary existence, but its necessary existence is sort of self-explanatory, self-contained in some way. And that, you can see how the second and third way really reinforce each other. In fact, the third way, you might say, is a kind of a development of the second way in some sense.
Yeah. So does he, in the part 3 argument, does he go as far as to argue for aseity of the necessary being?
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm trying to remember now what he says. I mean, he doesn't really say very much in that article itself, right? All he says is we have a being that is necessary per se, necessary in and through itself, right? And at least one, right? We haven't even proved there's only one of them yet at this point. And something that from which all the other necessary beings derive their necessity, and such that, of course, all contingent existing things depend on this necessary foundation. So the per se necessary beings are right at the very bottom of this whole process, the most fundamental thing. And so, yeah, so then the question is, what, and this will come up in later articles, what would a being have to be like? To be not just necessary, but necessary in and of itself, right? And that leads, I think, much to the same conclusion we saw in the second way. It would have to be existence itself, right? So that there was no possibility of its not being, because that's just what it is. It just is by very nature the source of existence.
Yeah, and that's so. At this point is usually when people kind of pivot and want to know, well, why does it have to be a perfect being? Why does it have to be something that, like it's something of that nature, which is, in part 4, the argument from gradation.
Right.
That's probably the one I understand the least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, so I've got my own take on this one too. So again, full disclosure, this is the Koonsian interpretation fourth way. It's not, no one else has quite the same interpretation, I don't think. But I think people have mistranslated the fourth way actually to some extent. So it's helpful to actually go back to the Latin in this case. And especially it's important to go back to Aristotle, because he refers to book 2 of the Metaphysics in the fourth way, and in the parallel passage in the Summa Contra Gentiles. And so anyway, this is just our background to my interpretation. I take the fourth way to be making this point, essentially, that where you have something that belongs to a certain kind of thing and is the cause of anything in that kind, necessarily the cause of anything in that kind, it's going to have to be supremely a member of that kind. It's going to have the characteristics of that kind to the greatest possible degree. So an example he gives is a helpful example, I think. In Aristotelian physics or chemistry, there's this thing called fire, right? Which is the cause, in a sense, of all heat. Things are hot by having more fire in them, and cold if they have less fire. We could think of fire as like energy, right? So the more energy you have, the hotter you are, right? And in a sense, the idea is that if we can say that energy itself has a temperature or a heat, which maybe it doesn't, but if it did, it would have to be maximally hot, right, in order to be the cause of the heat of everything else. And so the idea is that if God is the cause of all being, all possible being, right, then he has to be being in the most extreme kind. He has to be perfect being, unlimited being, right? Because again, if he were limited being in some way, then there'd be possible kinds of being that would be greater than him, right? And then he couldn't be the cause of those kinds of greater forms of being. But we've just proven in the first 3 ways, right, that he has to be the cause of any possible being whatsoever. So he has to have being to the greatest possible degree. So, I mean, the thing that's still hard, of course, for people to grasp then is, what does it mean to say that something is more than something else, right? And again, in analytic philosophy, we're sort of trained early on to think that existence is just binary. Either you exist or you don't. It doesn't really make any sense to say that some things have more being than others. But of course, the Aristotelian tradition would disagree and say, no, there's actually a good reason to talk about existence or being as having degrees here. So, that's a big discussion, obviously. But the thought is that, look, there's a sense in which a living thing, right, has powers and capacities that exceed the powers and capacities of any non-living thing in a sort of obvious way. You could imagine, inorganic things have a certain mass. You could imagine a living thing with the same mass, right? So on all the characteristics that non-living things have, you could always imagine a living thing that could match it. But living things have things like perception, right, growth, and so on, reproduction, that you can't imagine not inorganic things happening. They just completely lack that capacity. So living things just have being of a broader, deeper, more extensive kind than non-living things. And likewise, rational animals like you and I, exceed other living things by being able to do science and philosophy and understand things. Again, capacities are just nothing there like that in the non-living world. So we've got an even higher degree of being, right? And so the thought is, just keep extending that. If there are angels, they would have greater kind of being than we have, and so on. And then if you imagine the greatest possible being you can imagine, there's going to be something even greater than that, which is going to be the cause of its being, and that will have the maximum kind of being. So that means that, if we want to say, will this first cause be alive? Well, yes, in a sense, right? Because it's got to have being to a much greater degree than a merely living thing. Will it be rational or intelligent? Well, yes, because it's got to be the cause of all the rational, intelligent sorts of things, and so on. So all the perfections, all the things that we can attribute to beings that don't entail or imply any kind of limitation can be applied truthfully to God. Right? So you might say, well, God's the cause of cubes, so is he cubical? Well, no, because cubicality entails limitation, right? Cubes are only located in some places and not in others. They have a certain size and not any bigger. So those kind of predicates can't be applied to God. But power, cubes have power, yes. Does God have power? Yes. So power, knowledge, love, these things don't imply any limitations. And so they can be applied all the way up the hierarchy, so to speak, right up to God himself.
Yeah, it seems to me to be intuitive, at least in some sense, that if God has any attributes, or it would have to be in a perfect way. It doesn't seem like he could, especially if he's a simple being, how he could be an immutable. He can't gain more power or something like that. But a lot of people actually push back on the idea that if God has an attribute, it doesn't necessarily follow that it has to be at maximum. And I'm just like, no, it seems as though it has to.
And this reminds me, we go all the way back to the first way, actually, right? And so let's say that we've accepted that God is this timeless being, right? So for Aristotle, again, that means that God must be a changeless being, not just an actually unchanging being, but a being that couldn't possibly change. Because if there were any possibility of change in God, then that would put God in time, because we would say he could change, but he didn't, right? And so time would be sort of measuring his restfulness rather than his change. So to be truly timeless, God's got to be beyond the possibility of change. This is very clear in Aristotle, actually, already. But any finite being is in principle changeable, because those finite boundaries could be a little bit bigger or a little bit less than they are, in fact. And so only an infinite being could be changeless, absolutely changeless, right? Because it would have capacities that by their very nature have no boundary whatsoever, right? And so there's no possibility of even kind of fluctuating boundaries, as is the case for all finite things.
And it makes sense to me, but for some reason, there's some people who just don't. They don't want to like that.
If you're a reductionist about things like life and mind, right? If you thought that really there's just atoms in the void, and what we call life and mind is just kind of arrangements of those things, then we lose this sort of argument, right? All you can say is that God is real and he's powerful, and that would be it. But I think that kind of reductionism is very implausible for independent reasons. So.
Right. Yeah. It's matter of fact, the new hot position to take is mereological nihilism, and you're kind of just like, I don't know what to do with that. I mean, if things,
it seems to me that either you and I don't exist, right? Or I'm some kind of little particle floating around in my brain or something, and I think that I'm this three-dimensional extended thing. Both of the things seem really bizarre. I agree.
Yeah, it kind of cuts the feet out from everything, and like you say, it's just okay. There's this being that's necessary and all powerful. That's And well, how do you get to God? Well, you took everything else out.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't, if your view of the created world is completely wrong, it's going to be hard for you to get to God, right? You have to build on some fairly reliable knowledge about the creation.
You know what? That I'm going to create a meme with that quote. If your view is wrong.
Yeah.
From Rob Koons. I like that. And as we talked earlier, the argument from design is more about its the purpose or pointedness, or how would you kind of sum that one up?
Yeah, this is a harder one. So we mentioned earlier the idea that things have causal powers, and those causal powers themselves have a reference to the future, even to unrealized futures, right? So there's a kind of intentionality, as people put it, even in the inorganic physical world by virtue of these causal powers. The electron is sort of referring to possible states that may never happen, where it's repelling or attracting other particles through these powers. So that's certainly right. That's really all Aristotle or Aquinas mean by teleology or final causation or natural purposes, right? They don't mean that the electron actually thinking about where it's going or has feelings or urges, or they're nothing like that. They're not panpsychists or anything like that. They're not attributing those kind of feelings or urges to inorganic things. They're just saying we live in a world where things are directed in certain directions by their causal powers. And that Aquinas seems to be arguing here is already some reason to attribute something like purposefulness to God himself as the kind of ultimate ground of these purposes that we see in nature. So I think that's a big part of the argument. That's Ed Feser's interpretation. Actually, Gavin Kerr's. They say that's it. End of fifth way. I think there's maybe more going on there. It's a bit tricky. I take the parallel passages in the Summa Contra Gentiles and in De Veritate to be clues to what Aquinas means in the fifth way. But you could say, no, he's abandoned those when you get to fifth way. So there's an interpretive issue here. But I take them as clues. And so I think there is a kind of design argument here in Aquinas, but I think it's one that he gets from John of Damascus, actually, in the Orthodox faith, where the design is just the fact that things have powers that fit together in such a way that they're able to exercise their powers jointly. So if you had photons that had a power to energize electrons, and there were just no electrons, then that power would be odious. Right? And you can sort of imagine a world where you had a bunch of particles, and each particle had a bunch of powers, but none of the powers could ever be exercised because there weren't any other particles with the right kind of fit to the powers that they have. Or you could imagine a world where all the particles would just destroy each other immediately in one gigantic, big boom. And so what John Damascus says is, look, God obviously arranged things in such a way that things are able to persist through time and exercise these powers, these potentialities jointly, cooperatively, in order to create a kind of stable universe. And so you don't even need to get to God and the I and all that stuff, right? Just the fact that our inorganic universe, is persisting and kind of functioning in a regular way points to the idea there's a kind of design behind it all.
Yeah, it's right. And so to me, that it seems to be it's one of my favorite words, kind of intuitive, that you don't get order from chaos. The balance, the persistence, like you said, through time, the uniformity of nature, these things, it just doesn't seem plausible to me that you could just get that out of, some kind of chaotic cosmic accident or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Arthur Pryor has an interesting argument. It's sort of an anticipation of Richard Swinburne in some ways, that he says, there's like 10 to the 80th particles in the universe popping out of the Big Bang. Almost all of them fit into a very small number of kinds of particles, maybe 20 or 30 or something like that. That's amazing, right? That's an incredible, if that's just a coincidence, that seems really bizarre. So it's as if, again, there's somebody who said, let's just have lots and lots of particles, but let's make them all electrons or protons or neutrons or quarks, or, make them all similar to each other so that we get a coherent, intelligible world, right? You can just imagine. The ancient atomists like Democritus actually thought the world was made of an infinitely number of microscopic things, and each one was unique. no two of them belong to the same kind at all. And of course, in such a world, you couldn't do science. There's no possible chemistry, right? If every atom is totally unique from the other one. So, we sort of miss that, right? We get kind of used to this orderly universe God created, and we're not sort of amazed by it as we should be, right? Wow, there's so many darn hydrogen atoms around. What's going on, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's another one that I actually have a friend that I'm hoping to have on the show. You may know him, Seth Hart. I think you know Seth Hart.
Yeah.
I think he was at one of your conferences not too long ago.
Right.
But he's going to come on and talk about teleology and biology, the philosophy
I've been working on
of
that
biology.
too some lately.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I've got this whole project where I've been working on looking at quantum theory from an Aristotelian point of view, and arguing that that actually all my colleagues who are reductionists are working with an outdated Maxwell-Newton kind of picture of science, and that if you really understand quantum mechanics, it actually pushes you towards an anti-reductionist view about chemistry, and then ultimately about biology.
Yeah, it's everything's probabilistic. It's we have to have this Everettian model or the many worlds hypothesis to even try to keep uniformity.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. So you have to do these desperate measures. So the way I'd like to think about it, if you were a reductionist, you would think that as you got down to these smaller and smaller things would get more and more definite and determinate and sort of settled. And what we find is you just emerge in this cloud of uncertainty and potentiality as you get to the smaller things. It's only the bigger stuff like us that actually has any kind of definite determinate state at any given point in time. And that pushes very strongly against a kind of micro-reductionist picture of the world.
Yeah, I love quantum mechanics. I could go on and on about it. Well, it's really where philosophy meets science. Because there's so many philosophical positions, in quantum mechanics itself. Everything there is, pretty much hypothesis at this point.
That's what's really interesting. That's right. Whereas, nobody talked about the interpretation of Newton, right? That was pretty clear, right? And so suddenly, we have 18 different interpretations of quantum mechanics. That's really significant, I think. I think it shows that we've lost our way and lost our Aristotelian bearings, right? And so we're driven to all these extreme measures to try to recover things.
Yeah, I think people, take methodological naturalism so serious that they have to construct these models, to keep that method. And it's like
methodological materialism, really, or micro materialism, in effect.
And none of this necessarily leads to a theistic view. You don't, there's like Bernardo Kastrup. You can, he's not reductionist at all. He's, and he's a naturalist. So here are some hard questions for you.
Okay.
I know you don't claim to be an Aquinas expert, but today you are.
Okay. I'll try my best.
Yeah. What do you think Aquinas's favorite dessert was?
Wow. Yeah. I don't know. You see different portrayals of him. Some of them, he's quite hefty, right?
Yeah, chunky monk.
Which I suspect those are the more accurate ones, I guess. Yeah. So I'm guessing something like sticky pudding, right, would be the thing that he would go for. Yeah.
I like some bread pudding.
Exactly.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
All right. If you had to pick between country music, rap, and heavy metal, which one do you think Aquinas would take?
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. I guess maybe. That's a tough one. I don't really know rap or heavy metal that well.
Oh, okay.
But so I'm not sure. I mean, he might go with rap actually, just because he was a poet, right? I mean, he wrote hymns. Right. So, and that's maybe the most poetical of those three.
Yeah, he could probably write some bars.
I bet he could. Come to think of it. Yeah.
Do you?
I like that answer now. I'm going to go with that.
There you go. All right, that's his final answer. Do you have a few minutes for a couple of questions or a few questions?
Yeah.
Okay. We had some interesting ones, and they were imploring me to ask. So one of them is my resident Barthian.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. I got to find out. I have to scroll through. Anybody want to be a producer? I'll pay you 50 cents a day. Okay. It is basically, in a nutshell, I'll find it here, is what do you think of Barth's critique of natural theology or rejection of it?
Yeah. Yeah. So I find his interpretation of Romans 1 pretty implausible, actually, right? So Romans 1, 18, 19, right? That's the sort of charter of natural theology, you might say, right? God's eternal nature is revealed in the things that he's made. And Barth's interpretation of that is it's precisely the unintelligibility of things that he made that somehow proves that, I don't know, doesn't prove, but points us to this wholly other being and so on. So I mean, I just don't think that that's a plausible reading of what Paul's saying, right? And Paul's clearly alluding to things like in some of the deuterocanonical works like Wisdom of Solomon, where it says, points us to, the various wonderful things in nature, the adaptations and so on, as pointing to a creator. So there's that, and then there's the analogy of being stuff, and I think here. Well, this is another big debate, obviously. I don't think Barth gets Aquinas quite right on analogy. I think he reads him as being too much of a Scotist, really. He thinks that being is univocal, and that God is being and our being exactly the same. And clearly Aquinas doesn't want to quite say that, right? He does accept the fact that God is radically different from us, right? And so, I mean, there's just one last thing, right? I mean, Aquinas' natural theology is pretty negative, really, right? I mean, in fact, it keeps emphasizing the fact we don't really know what God is like, right? What we really know is that he's not like us, and that he's the cause of things. And so we know that we, in some sense, can attribute all these perfections to God, but what they actually mean in God is beyond our ken. So I mean, we do want to emphasize that kind of agnostic side of Aquinas. Some people sort of accuse Aquinas of being agnostic, right? Because sometimes he's so cautious about drawing conclusions about God's nature.
Okay. Yeah, it's and just to make sure, he asked me again in a different way.
Yeah. Does he know planning as a response to Barth? He might look that up. I basically agree with planning, I think, on that.
Oh, I didn't know that planning had a response.
I think it's in Warranted Christian Belief.
I've got that book. I'm gonna have to look at that. Maybe
it's not there. I'll have to find it. So it may be somewhere else. I could look it up for you.
Yeah, I'll have to. It's been so long since I read it. I can't remember now if he did or not. I have, of course, my physics guy wants to know about, are physics included in the fifth way, or mainly biology? I think he kind of answered most of that, but
yeah, it's certainly included, even more so than biology, really, I think.
Yeah, and so somebody's letting a cat out of the bag. Are you're working on a new book with your version of cumulative philosophical case for God's existence?
Yeah. That's still on the planning stage.
Oh,
so as I mentioned, Dan and I are working on a book on the 5 ways. So I think I'm going to get that out first, and then maybe turn my thinking to that cumulative case. But yeah, that's a promissory note, I'm afraid, at this point.
And this one is for me, just to give me confidence for today.
There we go. All right. Yeah, very good.
Oh, wait a minute.
One of my students called me that once, but it was many years ago.
Oh, okay. So somebody is getting the nitty gritty. Are you worried about Joe Schmidt's upcoming monograph on classical theism?
Well, I'm really not worried, but I mean, I'm very impressed by Joe. I mean, he's an amazing young man. I mean, what was he, just graduated, or is in the process of graduating. He's an undergraduate. He's published several things, and I've interacted with him quite a bit. But no, I think, well, look, obviously the debate over classical theism is never going to end, right? Because it is making these really radical claims about God, right? I mean, he's just off the charts in terms of all of our expectations about ordinary things. And so there's always going to be material there for the skeptic to say, oh, I just don't get it, or come on, these are incompatible, or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I understand I feel the pull of those things, but I also feel the pull of these first cause arguments saying you need a first cause, but it's going to have to be radically different from everything else to be a first cause. It can't be on the same plane as us, right? And so, I feel pressure of both these things, right? And this is why I'm sort of with Aquinas thinking, you have to posit a God, but you also have to be very humble about our grasping of what that's like, right? And we're just going to say negative things about it. And if Schmidt or somebody else says, but how is it possible for God to do these things? I don't know. I'm not. Hopefully someday I'll understand that. But at this point, I can't answer those "how is it possible" kind of questions.
Right. And we had one last one pop up, and this is from Really Theology again. I believe it's one of the Bens over there. I think it's Ben Watkins. I'm not sure. As a leading defender of theism, I would love to know what Dr. Koons thinks about atheistic philosophy of religion. How have things changed since the day of J.L. Mackie to Oppie and Draper?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting case where I do think that the two sides have sharpened each other in various ways. So I think, although I have a lot of respect for Mackie and Sobel, I knew Howard pretty well, and we interacted quite a bit. I think he did some really good work. But yeah, I think, and I don't know Draper's work that well, but I know Oppie's work. I think he's doing great stuff because he's responsive to the latest theistic arguments, and I'm always thinking about how to respond to Graham. So yeah, this is what philosophy is supposed to be like, right? It's supposed to be this dialogue where iron sharpens iron, and so
right.
I think both sides are making real progress.
I joke all the time about Oppie being the saint.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
On the other side, he's such a gentleman.
I appreciate that. I mean, the thing, the thing that I don't like is being ignored by so many people, right? I mean, I wish more atheist philosophers would, join the fray.
Right. Yeah. There's a few good ones out there.
Mm-hmm.
There definitely needs to be more. I agree. I think philosophy of religion, it's not just a religious thing, it's
right.
We need good questions. We need to think these things through and make sure we have a defensible, rational position.
And if I were an atheist, I'd still find it fascinating. Right? I wouldn't be able to stay away from it.
Absolutely. I would still be in philosophy of religion if I ever was, agnostic or an atheist.
I think that's right.
So, and we have come over the 1 hour and 10-minute mark. So I kept you a little bit longer. But I am very grateful and thank you so much for joining this show. I've enjoyed every minute of it, and I'm going to have to go back and listen a couple of times because there was so much good information, and I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Eddie.
Yep. And for everybody that's out there watching, thank you guys for being active in the chat. Thank you for everybody that was here, and we will see you next time. I hope to have a few shows coming up soon. Not such a long layoff again, but with that, you guys have a great day.